Right, you're at IDEO. Emily is from Cadena, and Jasper is with Wallet 713, and Avichal, of course, is our rockstar VC, cranking away over here. All right, so we have 30 minutes. I'll let you guys rock and roll.
Cool.
The panel is on perspective on Grin use cases, a big question for us.
Sweet. So from call to arms for cryptographers to designers and product and engineers. So quick show of hands, who in the audience actually built stuff? Writes code, designers. Wow, okay, fantastic. And who is a full-time investor? Awesome. Okay, good. You guys should invest in people building on top of this. Okay, so maybe we can start with quick intros. Gavin, you want to start? We'll just work back.
Yeah, hi, I'm Gavin. I work at the IDEO Collab. I've been doing open source things and work with product and UX for a number of protocols. And most recently, I've been building an open source Grin wallet.
Hi, I'm Jasper. I co-founded Vault 713, and we're trying to build stuff on top of Grin, and we already have a wallet that we'll continue to build out.
Hi, I'm Emily Pillmore. I am a senior Haskell engineer with Cadena and the lead maintainer of the packed smart contract programming language.
And I'm Avichal. I'm an investor. We try to invest in super early stage things and people working on top of Grin. So maybe we can start just quick background. What pulled you guys into Grin, and how are you? What's exciting to you about it right now? Yeah.
So at Cadena, we're particularly interested in using Grin as a use case for. Oh, sorry. Let me restart. To handle certain cases that we see that Cadena cannot actually address from a perspective of interoperability. Because Cadena is focused on smart contracts and a sort of high throughput proof of work blockchain, Grin sort of presents this interesting opportunity where we could potentially use it to handle our privacy solution.
So I've been following the blockchain world, for a couple of years now, and I was kind of looking for a way to get to actually build something and not just look from the sidelines. And it seemed like that Grin is a great opportunity to build these things and learn a lot. And I think a lot of the stuff like multi-signature, atomic swaps that already maybe exist in a lot of other coins, they still have to be built here. So it's I think it's a great opportunity for me and also for a lot of other people in the audience.
Other people. The community is primarily what drew me in. It's a really welcoming community. And then the second part, I think that we're all like the myth. There's an absurdly wonderful myth that surrounds this project that just kind of welcomes folks. And so that's,
Cool. So given that everybody here is already sort of in the broader crypto ecosystem, how do you guys think Grin fits into that ecosystem? I know you mentioned you're thinking about building on top. But maybe the really pointed question is there are some projects and ecosystems that already have a lot of developer energy and an ecosystem. And so this is not exactly the right way to look at it. It's a little bit zero-sum, but maybe the pointed question is, like, why would somebody commit time to the Grin ecosystem instead of, say, the Ethereum ecosystem?
I look at, and we've talked a little bit about it, but it's like, you don't build networks in isolation. And so the things that Grin might be best at in terms of invisibility, it's like you look at how you might go from network N to network Z. You might use Grin for the invisibility aspect. And so, all the atomic swap work that Jasper and folks have been doing, it's like you imagine it as Grin can be an interchange, or it can sit next to other networks. And so the relationship between network A and network B is wildly useful. And so because nothing exists in isolation, coming over to work on Grin and doing some work in this ecology makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you develop stuff inside Grin, for example, if you work on confidential assets or something, which is still in its very early stage, that it will probably also have applications to other blockchains as well. It's not just Grin that will profit from this.
Yeah, we see. Let's see.
No, that's fine. Well, I guess this is also good. I mean, you're about to talk about this, but I think it's potentially a good transition to, since the title here is use cases. What are the actual use cases that you guys are excited about, and that you're inside your projects, but also more broadly, what gets you? Where do you think this actually gets picked up and actually used?
Right. So we kind of see a lot of these technologies coming out as a kind of way of describing the same elephant, so to speak, where we're all sort of contributing to different portions of the ecosystem, which, some blockchain technologies address better than others. And we see Grin as being a great use case as a supplement to blockchains where perhaps data privacy is a little bit more the point than transactional privacy, where Grin can sort of fit in as a great sort of layer 2 solution to adding that extra sort of transactional privacy that the greater blockchain cannot, just as a sort of private chain type deal.
Jasper, I think you have some philosophical thoughts on privacy, right? For the use cases here.
Well, I mean, I think in general that everyone needs to be more, how do you say this, more mindful of their privacy, that we shouldn't expect, I think basically that privacy should be a default thing. It shouldn't be only if you have something to hide. I mean, you don't want to have put a camera in everyone's house to, will probably reduce crime a lot, but it's obviously not the way to go. And I think that's the same way with inside in the crypto space, that you don't, I mean, we should just have privacy by default, and you shouldn't, if I'm paying you for something, I don't want everyone to see that I'm paying you a specific amount for a specific thing.
Well, I think you were also saying when we were talking before, there's this really interesting market argument, I think, which is by putting it out there, you let people build on top of it, and you see what they stumble into, and you have to actually be okay as an ecosystem pushing the boundaries a little bit into gray areas to potentially stumble into stuff that's really, really interesting. And that's sort of the cost and the benefit. Gavin, do you have any thoughts on specific use cases that you get excited about?
Specifically what you just said.
Yeah.
It's Grin acting as the vehicle to push the edges and to push the boundaries where some other projects can't go necessarily because of some of the attributes of what this offers.
Yeah. So a couple that I get pretty excited about that I'll throw out for maybe both ideas for people who are interested in building, but also response. Healthcare has always, I think, been an interesting one that I get excited about. People are kind of used to HIPAA already. And I think, you could imagine that in certain parts of the world or even certain parts of the country, people may not be okay with certain medical procedures. And so being able to pay for those things privately actually might resonate with people. Do you have other thoughts on really specific examples that jump out for you guys, or response to the healthcare one? Do you think that's actually viable?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can take this one. So we saw the medical use case, which we think is fantastic, and certainly some people don't want to make certain payments visible to the broader network. But one of the great use cases that we thought about was, well, what if perhaps we had something like an intercept situation where reporters in sensitive areas possibly did not want to make the fact that they were relaying information public to the rest of the network. They could use something like a Grin to anonymously publish data and free up information in spaces where it's sort of closed off.
Do you guys have thoughts on B2B use cases? Often you see technology is first adopted by enterprises that have some rational reason for doing it. Do you have thoughts on B2B? Any of you guys?
I mean, the specific one that always keeps coming up with confidential assets, though, is just the idea of I want to be able to pay and not have any competitors see that which I'm doing. And so, again, I think Grin is particularly well suited for this.
Yeah, I was talking to some shipping companies, and it turns out actually that's exactly how they operate. So a lot of the blockchain, not Bitcoin sort of meme that comes out sometimes. It turns out they actually have this set of contracts where they pay somebody to show up. They're like, hey, you're going to take this load, and it's going to show up in Oakland 3 months later, and I'll pay you when it gets there. But they're super cagey about who they're working with and how much they pay them and all of the details of the contracts. And so B2B, I think, also makes a lot of sense. And so I guess, the one that we haven't really talked about that probably everybody is thinking about, some of the more illicit use cases like dark markets. And so do you think I'm curious if you guys think that's a good thing, it's a bad thing, no opinion, if that's where it sort of first takes off?
Personally, I don't have a strong opinion on it. I mean, if dark markets want to use it, they can use it. If they don't, then, I mean, we shouldn't stop developing anything or just because they might want to use it. I don't see it,
Yeah, I look at it as like expansion needs to happen in all directions, and so not just in one direction. So I think we need it in every direction. Just say it that way.
And so what do you say to a regulator who might be listening or watching this video stream who's saying, well, I don't want people to do any kind of like money laundering? How do you, what's the response?
I think there's a good response here in terms of how easy it is to money launder in the current financial system. It sucks to say, I'm sorry, but it is much more economically viable to launder money in the current system than it will be to do it on a blockchain. If you're going to do it, choose the current one, and regulators, fix that first. Blockchains are not going to be the way people are going to be laundering money. You simply cannot do it at scale fast enough.
Yeah, there's actually on this point, there's this great story. Somebody who was involved with SSL back in the mid-90s was telling me that kind of the flip side of this, so one is definitely like, look, there are better ways to money launder. The other part of it is there are really good use cases here, and we shouldn't shut them off. And so the story I was told with SSL was there were a bunch of congressional hearings around is this like a weapon? Should we regulate this somehow? Why do browsers, and Netscape in particular, just people involved with Netscape that told me the story, why should we allow SSL? Doesn't just mean terrorists and money launderers will be able to do stuff and we won't see it, which sounds pretty familiar right now, I think. And the really clever thing the Netscape team did was they made the case that there were real use cases like e-commerce where you wanted to have encryption and you didn't want your, hey, Senator, you don't want your credit card number floating around on the internet. And so I think this is actually a really important point of like, hey, regulators, actually, if you want to stop money laundering, go focus on $100 bills. Like that's actually where the money laundering is happening, and that's why also I think some of the ideas around actual use cases end up being really important in talking about what those use cases are, because it would be unfortunate if we cut off all the really, really good stuff. And I think SSL is actually a really good analogy from in the 90s, which, now it's kind of crazy, but everything is end-to-end encrypted, right? Well, not everything, but there are a lot of places where you can go and have end-to-end encryption, but there was actually a moment in time where it was almost, regulated and shut off. And so kind of switching to more tactical, so if you want to have medical payments or some of these other use cases, we talked B2B payments or all these other things we talked about, what actually needs to get built in the ecosystem? We have all these great people who are builders who might be looking for places where they can contribute. Where can people actually jump in, and what needs to be built right now to make all this happen? It's still pretty early.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of places where people can jump in and start working on it. I think I mentioned already a lot of them that, for example, multi-signature or cold storage, stuff like this is, I think, pretty important. And also atomic swap. So I did a proof of concept, which I'm now trying to build out into a library. And at some point, I would love to have more eyes on this as well, and get this working properly. And instead of just having a proof of concept, having actually, we can actually do atomic swaps live between Bitcoin and Grin and stuff.
This is the perfect area for, it's like what Daniel mentioned earlier about the minimal surface area of Grin. This is the community is kind of what's required in order to build out all the human-facing things that are going to be making Grin sing in terms of use cases. And so from wallet interfaces to exchanges to, liquidity provision for atomic swaps and so it's like this is as much a community coordination effort in terms of all of us here in the room is how I picture it, to build products that are usable and not have entirely different metaphors and things from product A to product B to product C, because in like in some system where you have a little bit more coordination, might be a little bit easier. But in this case, it's all coming from the ground up. And so this is the time for us kind of to get together and to figure out, okay, what works for us, what's germane to the community.
What about, right now, most people in this room probably speak English and have phones. And so how do you think about actually the global implications? I mean, a lot of the time, I think people talk about the real impact of this over the next decade might actually be more in the developing world than the developed world, where some of this infrastructure doesn't exist, or where some places where these norms aren't yet exactly set. So what needs to be built to sort of take this global?
Right, so there's one thing that was not mentioned between the two for the last question, and that was community-sponsored documentation in different languages, in mass, at different levels. And definitely developing a smart contract language, you feel this particularly more sensitively than you would otherwise. Just the idea of having a very basic tutorial on how to get Grin up and running, how to do an atomic swap, how to do anything that we end up building for Grin is immensely powerful. That is the way you get new people to use your product. You have to tell them how to use it. And to point to read the docs, I can say this because we actually did this. Don't do that. No one reads the documentation. They want to read easy to digest materials that the community has produced.
Yeah, so if you speak any other language than English, it sounds like get in there and write some documentation.
Yeah, get in there and just write it.
That's great. What about on the scriptless script sides? Do you think are there places where people can jump in and contribute there, or are there skill sets other than sort of cryptography and base level protocol engineering where you might want? I mean, you have this great room full of people. Like, what are the kind of skill sets you want to call out? Say, hey, please come engage with us on these things.
All of it. Sincerely, it's like a majority of the focus and resource has been on the core protocol, which it needs to be, but everything above that, which is where people will be interfacing with, which is product, so usability, design, UX, content, copywriting, the onboarding docs, the use cases, the coordination. I'm like hard pressed to find an area not where we need it. That's great.
And so I wonder if that's our signal to get off. If people do want to jump in on any of those things, like if somebody wanted to go write some documentation or help you with some of the atomic swap stuff, like what do you think is really tactically, what is the best way for people to actually do that?
Right, so I did this recently because I was asked to speak within the last 3 weeks or so. So I can tell you from personal experience, the GitHub documentation, the GitHub wiki, is a fantastic place to start. And then for anything else, I mean, I would defer to definitely Jasper if you want to learn about atomic swaps. Yeah, any of these guys. They're totally accessible. You can hang out in the Telegram, any of the social media, and you can interact with the team.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of ways to interact with the community, like you said. And one other I want to highlight is the Gitter channel, because that's where a lot of the devs hang out. And so if you're a developer, then come join us and ask us questions. And yeah.
We'll also be having, we're going to experiment with a community, like an open call for the ecosystem and people building on it. So kind of like they do the governance meetings every bi-weekly. We're going to experiment with one that's kind of product and ecology focused for everybody building anything above the protocol, whether it's a product or something. So we're going to start, we'll talk more about that later. But
yeah, I think we have that coming up pretty soon. So maybe from the audience, raise your hand if you're looking for people if you're already working on something and you're like, hey, come help me, come work on something. Is there anybody who's actually working on stuff? Oh, great. So you're all free to work with the protocol. That's great. Any questions from the audience while we have these folks up here? Somebody working on the protocol, somebody thinking about use cases. Any questions that people have about how to actually engage and actually build stuff? Or people have comments on stuff that they wish people would build while you have a room full of people who can actually go build? Good.
I had brought this up at some point previous, but the interactive nature of the Grin transactions makes things like really difficult from a consumer perspective. And I think having something like
You want to take the mic?
Yeah, so if we had some kind of a MetaMask equivalent, it would be really helpful for in-browser transactions, which, you know, is where most e-commerce takes place in the web browser. So I think you could definitely include an SPV type solution and have, you know, fairly reasonable security within that kind of solution. I think that would be really useful.
Thank you. Emily, in particular, so will you talk about the execution of a smart contract based on a trigger on Grin? How would that work? So does that make sense? So there's a trigger that I have stipulated, and based on that trigger, my smart contract executes.
Interesting. I don't think we don't have smart contracts on Grin, unfortunately. Sorry. You can actually have logic on Grin. So this is sort of one of the cons that was pointed out in previous talks. You have the idea of scriptless scripts, but you don't have the notion of a smart contract that you can trigger in any way. Right. So we don't have it yet. It's still theoretical, but the notion is if I were to have, say, an interop with my private chain or one of our public chains, which are more data-oriented as opposed to transaction security-oriented, we would create a private chain, and the entry point would be some wallet, you know, with which we would pool funds to run on the Grin blockchain within this private chain, and we would do whatever we want in Grin as a Grin script, or scriptless script, I'll just call them scripts, and we would execute individual transactions that way and then just simply post them to the mainnet as a sort of finalized one-off transaction, as opposed to actually writing a smart contract for Grin on our public chain, right? So it's still the same protocol. You still can't write logic for it, but you do have the ability to make use of the great sort of scriptless features that are going to be available just through this sort of like wallet barrier to the private chain.
Cool. So in the last minute here, anybody working on something super cool that they want to call out? Get some free publicity for what you're working on? No? All right. Nobody wants to take the mic. All right, guys. Thank you so much for the time. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.